Hello, Telesur English present a new episode of China Now, our media's production that showcases the culture, technology and politics of the Asia giant. In this first segment, we are going to start with China currents with topics such as China issuing a ban that could cripple all U.S. high-tech weapons, a Philippine vessel colliding with a Chinese ship, Taiwan to lose its diplomatic ties with the U.S., and much more. Let's see.
China Currents is a weekly news talk show from China to the world. We cover viral news about China every week and also give you the newest updates on China's cutting-edge technologies. Let's get started.
Welcome to China Currents, your weekly news report on what's happening in China. I'm Lisa. In this episode, China has issued a ban that could cripple all U.S. high-tech weapons. The Philippine Coast Guard vessels deliberately collided with a Chinese ship. Australia betrayed their promise to Hong Kong separatists. Taiwan Island is about to lose its largest diplomatic tie in the Americas. A monkey from China has set several world records in the gaming industry. Let's start with a new Chinese law that could potentially neutralize all American high-tech weapons. In a joint statement on the 15th of August, China's Ministry of Commerce and the General Administration of Customs said China will impose export controls on antimony products, including antimony ores, metals, oxides, and other rare antimony compounds, and has kicked off a comprehensive sanction on antimony against the US. Antimony is known for its wide use, especially in the military sector. For instance, antimony trioxide is commonly used as a flame retardant in aircraft, rockets, and missiles. It is also used in production of military equipment such as armor-piercing shields, explosive night vision goggles, and nuclear weapons. An indium antimonide is primarily used to manufacture high-performance sensors and array seekers. These seekers play a crucial role in guiding missiles, which are highly effective against fourth-generation fighter jets. The media has long emphasized the critical role of antimony in U.S. military production. Experts have urged China, the world's dominant supplier of antimony, to limit its export to the United States. This call stems from America's heavy reliance on China's antimony exports and processing capabilities, which are essential for manufacturing advanced military equipment such as stealth fighters, missiles, and night vision devices. China is responsible for over 80% of global annual antimony supply, making it the world's largest producer. Russia is the second largest, accounting for 7% of the global output, while the United States produces less than 1%. Given this data, any export restrictions imposed by China could significantly disrupt the supply chain of the U.S. military industry. In response to this vulnerability, the U.S. Congress has asked the Pentagon to strengthen its strategic reserves of critical minerals, with antimony being a top priority for the National Defense Stockpile. The U.S. House Armed Services Committee has also expressed concerns about potential supply chain disruption from both Russia and China in a recent report. The committee has urged the Department of Defense to develop policies for recycling used batteries in order to recover precious metals, rare earth elements, and other strategically important materials. Historically, the United States sourced antimony from a gold mine in Idaho, but that mine closed down in 1997. According to a 2020 report from the U.S. Geological Survey, there are currently no active antimony mines operating within the United States. China's statement on the export controls highlighted that a key rationale is to prevent the proliferation of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, aligning with its long-standing efforts to fulfill non-proliferation obligations. Following the suspension of nuclear arms control talks with the U.S. in April, prompted by Washington's arms sales to Taiwan Island, China's tightened controls on antimony export can be viewed as an extension of its countermeasures against the United States. Given the size of US nuclear arsenal, China can impose significant constraints by limiting access to key materials essential for production. This move represents a shift from China's previously more open approach to supplying critical materials to the US. In recent years, Japan and other developed countries in Europe paid higher attention to the strategic reserve of antimony, placing it on critical mineral list, as global antimony ore reserves dropped from 2 million tons in 2021 to 1.8 million tons in 2022. Declining ore grades and resource depletion have led to a continuous fall on global antimony production. Although high-tech weapons rely heavily on rare metals and resources, antimony also has important applications in the field of biology and medicine field. Antimony-based drugs such as meglumine antimonate are also considered the primary treatment for leishmaniasis, an infectious disease caused by parasites. China's new export control law may help ensure that this precious resource is used to save lives rather than for military purpose. Despite China's ongoing efforts to promote global security, the Philippine Coast Guard ramped up regional tensions. On the 19th of August, 2 Philippine Coast Guard vessels entered Chinese waters in the South China Sea without authorization from the Chinese government. The Chinese Coast Guard claimed that the Philippine ship ignored repeated warnings and deliberately collided with a Chinese vessel in an unprofessional and dangerous manner. The footage released by China's Coast Guard showed the Philippine vessel numbered 4410 sailing alongside the Chinese ship before suddenly turning towards it, causing damage to the Philippine vessel. Interestingly, the video also showed at least 2 individuals on the Philippine vessel carrying professional camera equipment along with several US journalists. This was later confirmed by a report from ABC News on the 19th, which stated that some of the videos and photos were taken by journalists from a US television network. These American journalists were likely on board because they trusted the professionalism of the Philippine Maritime Forces, given their recent joint exercise with the US Navy. However, the incident has now called that trust into question. Less than a day after the ramming incident, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan condemned China during a phone call with its Philippine counterpart. Sullivan also reaffirmed the $500 million in U.S. foreign military financing to the Philippines under the 2024 Indo-Pacific Security Supplemental Appropriation Act. This bill, signed into law by President Biden on the 24th of April, aims to boost the Philippine military's capability to escalate tension in the South China Sea. According to reports by the Philippine Star, Philippine President Marcos expressed his gratitude for the U.S. military aid during the meeting with a U.S. congressional delegation on the 8th of August. Marcos emphasized the importance of this aid in addressing new challenges in the region. The recent action of the Philippine government have indeed created new challenges for China-Philippine relations, especially in terms of trade. Data released by General Administration of Customs of China in July showed a new record with the total value of China's imports and exports reaching $2.96 trillion in the first half of the year, a year-on-year increase of 7.1%. However, in the first 4 months of 2023, the bilateral trade between China and Philippines dropped by 10.31%. It remains to be seen whether the United States will compensate the Philippines for this trade loss in the 2025 Indo-Pacific Security Supplemental Appropriation Act. Compared with the Philippines, Australia is clearly more pragmatic in its approach to China relations. On May 2020, the UK and Australia promised to provide asylum to Hong Kong separatists holding British national overseas passport, who had violated China's national security law in Hong Kong. As of February 2024, the UK Home Office estimated that there are around 2.9 million BNO passport holders in Hong Kong. However, data revealed by the South China Morning Post on August 14 shows that the approval rates for asylum applications from Hong Kong are extremely low in both Australia and the UK. Over the past 5 years, Australia has reviewed only 584 asylum applications, with just 5 being approved. People seeking asylum usually need to prove that they are unable to live safely in their own countries. For these Hong Kong separatists, their actual situation in China makes it difficult for them to meet Australia's protection approval criteria. Earlier this year, there were signs of improving relations between China and Australia. On 29th of May, China lifted its ban on 5 Australian beef exporters. This was followed by Chinese Premier Li Qiang's official visit to Australia on the 15th of June, during which both nations agreed to strengthen their bilateral relationship with a focus on expanding cooperation across various sectors. This context suggests a more nuanced and complex dynamic between China, the UK, Australia, and the Hong Kong separatists seeking asylum. While the UK and Australia have made public promises, the actual asylum approval rates indicate the challenges these separatists face in successfully relocating. The improving China-Australia relations also provide a backdrop to these developments. Interfering with China's internal affairs has never been a good deal, but it seems Paraguay is only just beginning to realize this. According to Reuters, on 22nd of August, Paraguayan president is reconsidering his country's diplomatic ties with Taiwan authorities in pursuit of trade deals with mainland China. In an interview with a Japanese outlet, the Paraguayan president admitted he is under pressure from domestic agricultural groups, urging Paraguay to cut off diplomatic relations with Taiwan Island. A 2023 report by the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean stated that trade between China and Latin America expanded 35-fold from 2000 to 2022, reaching nearly $500 billion in 2022. In contrast, The Economist reported that from 2019 to 2023, Taiwan authorities have only provided Paraguay with $115 million in aid. An article in The Economist on the 4th of July highlighted that the price of Paraguayan loyalty is rising. The previous administration asked Taiwan for $1 billion in investment, but did not receive it. Meanwhile, the director of the Millennium Institution for China and Latin America Studies, Francisco Ernest, stated that Paraguay's relationship with Taiwan cost the country more than 1% of its GDP annually due to missed investment and credits from China. Next up, let's focus on a monkey from China who has recently left a lasting impression on global gamers. On the 20th of August, the Chinese video game Black Myth: Wukong launched globally and quickly gained massive popularity. Within just 1 hour of its release, the game reached over 1 million concurrent players online, surpassing the records set by high-profile titles like Cyberpunk 2077 and Elden Ring, according to a Bloomberg report. By the 23rd, Black Myth: Wukong had officially announced over 10 million copies sold across all platforms, with peak concurrent online players exceeding 3 million. This is the first time in history of Steam, the world's largest game distribution platform, that a single-player game has reached such a large number of concurrent players. The overwhelming demand for download even caused some servers to crash temporarily. The game also gathered significant attention from Chinese state media due to the development team's meticulous recreation of 36 real-life ancient Chinese buildings, 27 of which are located in Shanxi province, including a Foguang temple, the third earliest preserved timber structure in China. Today, the temple is a part of UNESCO World Heritage Site and is undergoing restoration. However, in the game, players can not only appreciate the stunning scenery of the temple, but they will also engage in battles against the game's monsters within its historically significant location. This effort to preserve and promote Chinese cultures has earned widespread recognition from Chinese investors. Following the game's release, the stock of the publishing company surged by 40% in just 4 days. The success of the game Wukong also spurred the growth of the entire Chinese gaming industry, with the gaming sector of the Chinese stock market rising by 1.71% on August 20th. Former World of Warcraft team leader praised Wukong as a great victory in a tweet. While the game has been praised by investors and industry insiders, the BBC reported that it included anti-feminist propaganda, fetishization, and other content that instigate negative discourse. In response, Chinese netizen remarked, "Black Miss Wukong is like chocolate. Everyone has their own taste, but is lethal if a dog eats it." And that is all for today. Thank you for watching this episode of China Current. If you have any thoughts or comments about our show, please reach us at the email address below. We look forward to hearing from you and see you next time.
We'll go for a short break, but we'll be right back. Stay with us.
Deep gazes filled with struggles and stories. Struggles that transcend generation. No
Welcome back to China Now. In this second segment, we have Thinkers Forum with Glenn Diesen, Norwegian academic and political scientist specialized in Russian foreign policy, political economy, conservatism, and Eurasian integration. Also is Camille Escalante, co-founder of Casachu News and Latin American correspondent at TV Press. Let's have a look.
The big change for Russia came in 2014. And there was two things that happened. One, the Greater Europe initiative they had died, and also an alternative Eurasian format emerged. So it's important to realize that for the past 300 years, since Peter the Great, Russia always looked towards the West for modernization, also since the early 18th century. In the West is where the main technologies were. The West also dominated the seas, as where the main transportation corridors are, which can physically connect the world. Also this was the area of financial connectivity of the world, so they had everything. This is why Russia's integration into an international economic system, pursuing prosperity and modernity, always meant to Europeanize Russia, to make it more European. Now, there's always been some concerns about this, especially those who read Dostoevsky, all these 19th century scholars arguing that perhaps Russia should look more towards the East. Anyways, after the Cold War, Russia continued this tradition of looking to the West. They wanted to make peace with the West. They wanted to modernize their economies. So they began to then pursue these very pro-Western policies. However, what they found out was that this Greater Europe was denied. That's what NATO expansion represented, that we were going to create a Europe without Russia. And a Europe without Russia quickly became a Europe against Russia, simply because we then had to compete over where the new dividing lines would be instead of removing them. So the problems always built up. And in 2014, this is when everything broke, because until then, many people in Russia thought, well, perhaps we can have an incremental integration with the West. But when the West toppled the government in Ukraine, this was the clear signal that Ukraine would not be a bridge, but it would be a front line. And when Russia took Crimea in order to safeguard its Black Sea fleet, then and all the sanctions came, even the few Russians who still wanted to pursue Greater Europe had to recognize this was utopia. It was never going to happen. And what happened at the same time, exactly the same time in 2013-14? Well, this is when China really began to lay the foundations for an alternative international economic system. That is, the Chinese began to push this Belt and Road Initiative. They started to more openly assert ambition to take technological leadership in the world. China began to advance these new financial institutions, be it the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, looking to internationalize its currency. We see that the SCO or BRICS, it represents a world order based on multipolarity, in which the great powers, they seek to harmonize interest with each other rather than pursue the dominance and global hegemony. And this is very important to recognize because in the West, we at least for the past decade, we always predicted that the Chinese and Russians would start to fight over Central Asia, but they don't. They attempt to accommodate each other's interests. No one is seeking hegemony, and thus they can avoid the zero-sum approach to security. So suddenly a new system emerged in the East. So this was tremendously important time in history for Russia. And when it goes to the East, it notices that it doesn't have the same historical baggage. It doesn't meet the same hostility. And even the fact that China is the biggest country there and not Russia, it actually works often to Russia's advantage. So I think 2014 was really the main era, because this is when Europe really slammed the door in the face of Russia and a new door opened in the East, which was China. And that's when this greater Eurasia ambition really began to move forward. The main problem for Russia has always been it had unfavorable asymmetrical interdependence with the West. So we often say that interdependence between nations is good, it creates peace. Well, yes, to some extent, because in all interdependent relationships, one will always be more dependent on the other. So this goes with people as well as states. Now, when you have huge asymmetries, then one side can use that to extract political power from the rest. So let's say, for example, a relationship between the collective West and Russia. If 90% of Russian trade is dependent on the West, while 3% of the West trade is dependent on Russia. This is asymmetrical. Now the West it's much less dependent on Russia than Russia is on the West, and the West can use this to extract political concessions. Now, and this is what we saw. We saw Russia being dependent on the West for its technologies, access to transportation corridors, banks, currencies, payment systems, insurance systems, everything. The only thing really Europe was dependent on Russia was energy. And we did everything we could to reduce this, to have maximized interdependence. Because in any interdependent relationship, you get some influence, but you lose some autonomy. If you have asymmetrical interdependence, you maintain your autonomy and you get influence over the other. So this is the problem for Russia. This was the condition for creating a Europe without Russia. How can you have a Europe where we leave out the largest country on the continent? For Russia, if they want to have some political autonomy and security and act as an independent pole of power in a multipolar world, they need to diversify their partnerships. Yes, they need some strategic autonomy in key sectors, for example, technology, energy, but they need to diversify partnerships, and this is what they failed to do. So ideally, Russia would, be very close with China, but also India, Iran, Korea, Japan, but also the EU, US, to have as many partners as possible, so no one can bully it. So this excessive dependence on the West is really the mistake I would refer to, which was very damaging for Russia. What I argued is that the Russians will be somewhat concerned not to recreate this in the East. In other words, Russia's pivot to the East can't simply become a pivot to China. Why? Well, because China is much more powerful, at least economically, than Russia. So it doesn't want to get stuck in a partnership where, again, 95% of its trade is dependent on China, and 2% of Chinese trade is dependent on Russia, because that would be a very uneven relationship. So this means Russia really has to diversify its partnerships. Yeah? So not just integrate with China, but also look a bit to India, Iran, Korea, and also the rest of the world. And what has been a very pleasant experience for the Russians is that China is okay with it. They're not sabotaging it. And this is something new to the Russians, because whenever Western countries have deal with Ukraine, Central Asia, Turkey, Armenia, a key objective is always to decouple them from the Russians, to sever ties between them. The Chinese have never done this, and part of the reason is because China is happy with the multipolar system. If China wanted to recreate a Chinese hegemony to replace an American one, they would have tried to cut Russia's tie from other states and made it subordinate. But it's not doing this, and this is what is very reassuring to the Russians, and this is also an indicator why we're seeing a multipolar system emerge, where yes, China is the leading state, but it's not seeking to dominate others. I wrote this book a decade ago. It's Russia's Geoeconomic Strategy for Greater Eurasia, where I kind of pointed out that this soft balancing has to be in place in order for the integration or Greater Eurasia to be durable. But at this moment, they're getting deeply involved with the Chinese partnership, and they're very comfortable with it because they can maintain their political autonomy. So again, 10 years ago, this book wasn't received that well. People said it's marriage of convenience. There's never going to be any de-dollarization. This was almost science fiction. But we see 10 years later now, this is the direction things are going, because states will seek what I call a balance of dependence. Well, it's also become a cliche that one hegemon or one leading power doesn't hand over the mantle peacefully to the next one. There's usually conflict. And I think the United States have tried everything now. They did a lot to sabotage China's technological industries, with the chip bans, encouraging other countries to decouple from China. They can put pressure on transportation corridors, access to finance. Again, there's a lot that the United States has done. But none of this is working. They could have done this maybe 10 or 20 years ago, but now China's too big, it's too late. So this is why the United States is now leaning towards militarizing the rivalry instead. And that's why it's important with a proxy. Well, it doesn't have to be Taiwan. It could also be Philippines, because it's great empires. They try not to fight with their own troops. Also, if you don't want to fight a huge great power like Russia or China with your own military, it will be devastating. They probably would lose, and it could escalate into nuclear war. So it's better to fight with proxies. And if you're going to fight the Russians, then obviously for them Ukraine will be the best proxy to fight. Now with the Chinese, you would use Taiwan or Philippines most likely, which is where the Americans are now sending their weapons, encouraging more antagonistic relationship with Beijing. This is what the direction the Americans are going. Under the One China principle, the Americans should limit themselves to economic and cultural ties to Taiwan. Instead, we're seeing now that they're sending their top politicians there, which is a breach. They're sending military trainers there, which is a breach. And they're step by step trying to dismantle it. So asking for more representation for Taiwan in international institutions such as the UN. So effectively beginning to give it the status of a sovereign country, which is not correct, because our peace and stability with China is based on this principle that there is one China. Taiwan is a part of China. And if we try to abandon this, then there will be war. And it's not in China's interest to use military force against Taiwan. I think China is quite confidently sees as its economy grows, it will able to integrate Taiwan more through peaceful means, economic connectivity. So waiting for more favorable government perhaps. So the only reason why I think China would use military force is if the Americans are pushing for Taiwan secession. I think that's the red line for China. The Chinese should be careful, because if the Americans are looking for a proxy war, like they did with Ukraine, because keep in mind, in Ukraine, the same thing happened. The Russians went in because America sabotaged all peace agreements. They went in with the military, which was this unprovoked invasion. And on the first day they attempted, they reached out to the Ukrainians to start peace negotiations, which they did. And then the Americans came and sabotaged it because they wanted a war, and they chose a war. And this is why it's one should be careful not to walk into a similar trap over Taiwan. But China and Russia have different relationship with Washington over the past 30 years, because China had a more favorable position. The Russians, they had a military bloc gradually expanding on their border. They were never offered a status quo. Instead, they had to see NATO march slowly on its borders, with the repercussions being quite predictable. So this often made it necessary for Russia to punch above its weight, to really flex its muscles beyond even what it had the capability to match with action. Now, China was a bit of the opposite. Favorable, there was no military bloc marching on its borders. It tried to not create any waves. So what's also called a peaceful rise, just try not to create too much draw too much attention to itself, which would make the American empire strike against China, try to, knock it down. So this is why we saw the different paths by the Chinese and the Russians. But now, of course, China's become too powerful for America's comfort. So now they kind of have to come out of the closet as well and start to push back, which is what we're seeing.
There's an endless list of ways in which the mainstream corporate media internationally has wrongly portrayed Venezuela. In the past, going back to the years in which the sanctions were really having a visible impact on the country, they were depicting scenes of hungry people. At some point, they found images supposedly of people eating out of a dumpster. They made these headlines about people eating zoo animals or something absolutely bizarre like that. Things in Venezuela are relatively normal in terms of everyday commerce, in terms of people going to their workplaces. Things are being sold out in the streets, especially in the capitals and in the capital of the country, Caracas. Things are bustling as normal. Public transportation has resumed. And so we know the situation from the past that the mainstream media internationally likes to show a country in chaos. But the reality is that there was some violence and there was some incidents of terrorism. We call these armed gangs and these violent groups in the street guarimbas. But they went out and they committed acts of arson. They attacked people and all of these different crimes, which we can get into. But what the authorities have said is that the people who carried out those different acts of violence were in large part paid by the opposition. They were people who had a criminal record profile. They were young street kids. Some of them were minors, so they were actually teenagers. And a lot of them had recently returned from places like Chile, Peru, and the United States in what seems to be an organized plan to carry out these acts of violence. And the authorities have also said that in making the arrests, it has been found that many of these people didn't even cast a vote. So things are really returning to normal in that sense, that there's that period of violence has ended. But of course, there have been a lot of mobilizations in favor of the government's triumph, President Maduro's triumph in his re-election. Every day there have been large rallies in support of the government that have marched to the Miraflores Palace, the presidential palace in Caracas. And at the same time, there have been some rallies in support of that main opposition, which came in second in those July 28th elections. Apart from that, there is something that's a little bit odd, and that's, of course, that the media has once again turned its eye to Venezuela, that the headlines once again include Venezuela, and that the State Department and the European Union, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Canada, and all of these other countries are paying very close attention, and they're emitting statements all of the time, and also other countries of Latin America with right-wing presidents and governments. There's an endless list of ways in which the mainstream corporate media internationally has wrongly portrayed Venezuela. One of the things is that they show a lot of opposition support, and they always depict huge support in the streets while trying to convey a message that the support for the government is dwindling over time and that people don't feel as enthusiastic as they once did. The fact is that we saw during this campaign season that there was huge support in the streets for maintaining the Bolivarian Revolutionary Project and in support of the re-election of Nicolas Maduro, and that he had huge rallies all across the countries in all the main cities, and of course in the capital, it goes without saying that the final campaign closing rally just a few days before the election was absolutely massive and possibly the largest political rally we've seen in Venezuela since Commander Hugo Chavez. And so, they're showing, misrepresenting the levels of support for this government in the country. Of course, we saw, in the past, going back to the years in which the sanctions were really having a visible impact on the country, they were depicting scenes of hungry people. At some point, they found images supposedly of people eating out of a dumpster. They made these headlines about people eating zoo animals or something absolutely bizarre like that. The fact is that in the global south, and particularly in Latin America, one of the main issues that we face is that salaries are low. They are objectively low in Latin America compared to the global north. On average in Latin America, the minimum wage earner is earning in a month's time, $200. They're not earning what we earn in North America. And so that's a huge reason why people have migrated northward. It's not because of these issues that are being spoken about in the human rights industry based in Washington or Brussels or Berlin or wherever they're based. It's not what the State Department is saying, that it's because of human rights or repression or because of the stifling of fundamental freedoms in the country, because of political persecution, or all of these things that have been fabricated. It is that people just want to live in another country and seek better economic opportunity. And the economy is growing and has really recovered in the last 3 years because of some of the measures taken by President Maduro and his government. This is a country that for a period of years had hyperinflation, in which the local currency was worth very little. And so it was almost useless to carry around cash. You had to use a debit card for any purchases. And now the exchange is actually at 36 bolivars are the equivalent of $1. So it's much easier to make purchases there. And things have really normalized. You see investment from foreigners. You see a lot of tourism has returned. A lot of Venezuelans have returned. Just to speak a little bit about the way in which things have really improved economically in terms of the living conditions for regular people. A lot of the products that had gone missing have returned. Now it's a country that has become overwhelmingly, and the government would say completely, food sovereign, which means that they're no longer having to import food from neighboring countries and friends, but they're able to produce a lot of it. So this is something that has really changed. Things have, like I said, improved in the country, and the press simply has not reported on that. It really is a normal country in that there are ride apps. If you want a taxi, you go on your phone and you go onto your app and you choose your location and where you want to go, and you call it, and you go like anywhere else. You go to a nightclub, you go to a bar, people are selling things in the streets. There are, people go on vacation. There's domestic tourism. And so there are, of course, endless ways in which the media is misrepresenting the country. But what's fascinating is that the media is still able to operate in Venezuela without any sort of censorship or anything at all. If you see the international press conferences held by President Maduro at the palace, he invites the journalists and correspondents in the country accredited from F8, from Reuters, from AP, from BBC, among many others. And they are there constantly providing information, despite that so many of them have lied about the situation in the country for so many years. The opposition that we're largely talking about, the one that came in second in the November 28th elections, you're seeing them as the main representatives of the country, even though they're the opposition in the international mainstream media. They have a huge presence on social media, and they have a lot of resources, because we know that in past years they've received a lot of funding from NGOs linked to the State Department. And in that way, they have been able to fund protests within the country in Venezuela, but also a lot of online campaigning and propaganda in support of regime change. These people have gone out and largely lived in the exterior, some of them as millionaires in luxury condos in places like Bogota, Miami, Washington, and Madrid, which has for years sought sanctions, these unilateral coercive measures, of which there are more than 900 that are imposed against Venezuela, really striking the Venezuelan people. We saw in 2018 the creation of what was called the Lima Group, which was a group of countries that came together, all with right-wing governments, to try to oust the democratically elected popular government of Nicolas Maduro. They started holding meetings in places like Ottawa and Canada and all around Latin America about Venezuela. And this is actually something that they're trying to do again right now. They're looking for ways to meet a gathering of presidents, sometimes a gathering of foreign ministers of these right-wing governments, look for ways to attack Venezuela essentially with different forms of aggression, to pressure them politically, to emit joint statements together. The United States has this strategy of using its close allies, but really we can see the way in which all of this has been orchestrated by Washington in order to mount more political pressure as just one of its strategies. At the same time, it's mounting more economic pressure with the announcement of new sanctions all of the time, especially sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector. The oil issue in Venezuela is one of the most important issues, of course. So you can just look and see what's taking place right now in Guyana to see that it is a country that has essentially become a U.S. protectorate, a U.S. territory. They are sending all sorts of Southcom troops in order to do supposed joint military exercises with the Guyanese military, but really they're just trying to create the necessary conditions in order for Chevron and ExxonMobil to be able to extract oil from this region. Venezuela is not the only country that has huge oil reserves, but it is perhaps the largest right now, and definitely the largest in South America. It's very important that the U.S. get its hands on that oil, but also with the oil, Venezuela, since Commander Hugo Chavez has been able to help many of its neighbors. It's been able to help neighbors through its PetroCaribe program, in which it was selling oil to these countries at huge subsidies, huge subsidized prices, in order for them to become more economically independent from other world powers. And it has been a huge help. Additionally, under the formation of this articulation of countries, which is ALBA TCP, Venezuela and Cuba have been able to help these other Caribbean countries of the Eastern Caribbean states with things like medical missions and sharing medical supplies when things are donated from countries like China and Russia. And these sorts of supports allow these countries to build and take their own independent path, asserting their right to implement their own models, and are breaking away with Monroe Doctrine and United States dominance. The United States is obviously not content with that. They know that there are endless opportunities in resource extraction, even apart from oil, if they're able to gain control over that country's resources, but they know they can only do that by installing one of their allies of this far-right opposition. This is a country that was highly reliant on the income generated from its oil sector. And so the way in which that was impacted was that because of the unilateral coercive measures, it was very difficult for Venezuela to do crucial things like purchase the necessary replacement parts in order to repair its oil refineries. They suffered huge fuel shortages in a country which itself produces oil. They had to rely on cooperation with Iran to be able to recover its oil industry. And Iran was even bringing fuel over to Venezuela during a crucial moment in perhaps 2020, 2021 to Venezuela. There were a lot of shortages of food, as was widely reported. And part of why that happens is the same reason why it happens in countries like Cuba under the blockade, which has lasted more than 60 years, which is that there are issues with making purchases under these unilateral coercive measures, but there's also issues in which the shipping companies themselves and these sort of third parties don't want to enter into any contracts or do any commerce or trade having anything to do with a sanctioned entity, whether it be a government official of Venezuela, whether it be the Venezuelan state, because of the way in which they could be subject to secondary sanctions. And so that creates a situation where people don't want to take any risks because it could harm them economically, even if they're, let's say, some completely random South African shipping company. So they were deprived of medicines and other crucial things such as insulin for diabetic people. And this created a lot of difficulties. Thankfully, in large part, and thanks to a lot of Venezuela's close allies, they've been able to largely overcome that. I think Venezuelans know that if the empire were able to overturn their revolution and come in and actually consolidate a coup, that it would be catastrophic for all the rest of our countries.
And this was another episode of China Now, a show that opens a window to the present and the future of the Asian Giant. Hope you enjoy it. See you next time.